Alcatraz, the most infamous high-security prison in the world, was where Victor Lustig was heading. Victor had just been captured after running a counterfeit banknote operation that was so big it posed a serious risk to the entire economy. And yet, this fraud wasn't even Victor's most infamous scam. Victor ran countless get-rich-quick schemes and was possibly the most dangerous and successful conman the world has ever seen. But most of all, he will be remembered as the man who sold the Eiffel Tower. Twice. This is the crazy true story of how a broke petty thief became the most wanted man in the world. The man we know today as Victor Lustig was most likely born in 1890 in the Austro-Hungarian town of Hostany, which is today part of the Czech Republic. But truth be told, we don't know for sure, as his real identity remains a bit of a mystery even now. That's because throughout his life, he used at least 45 different aliases to cover his tracks and would frequently lie about who he was and where he was from. He changed his name, appearance, and identity from one place to the next, a kind of shape-shifting conman, traveling the world, finding new ways to scam his victims. However, the information we do have about his childhood suggests that Victor's younger years were miserable, spent inside a dark and grim stone house in one of the most impoverished areas of the city. He described his parents as the poorest peasant people who could barely afford to feed and clothe their children. They split up when Victor was 8 and sent him to live with some relatives, a situation which he found completely insufferable. By the time he turned 12 years old, Victor concluded that he would be happier on his own, so he dropped out of school and ran away. He began living on the cold streets of various European cities, and as a result, he had to resort to pickpocketing and begging in order to eat. But it was one singular event in 1903 that made him decide to pursue a life of crime. At the time, Victor was a 13-year-old outcast struggling to survive on the streets of Budapest. And one spring evening, he was desperately digging through the trash bins outside a fancy hotel, searching for scraps of food, when he noticed a couple getting ready to eat on one of the hotel's balconies. Victor watched on as the waiters brought plate after plate of food to them, arranging a feast fit for a king, more food than Victor had ever seen in his life. And yet, Victor watched on horrified as the couple didn't even eat a single morsel of the food, and instead headed straight to the bedroom. Victor couldn't believe it. All that delicious food just sitting there, and they weren't even going to eat anything. Right then and there, Victor decided that if that's how some people could afford to live, whilst he was forced to eat scraps out of the garbage, he would never feel guilty about conning those more fortunate than him. After that, Victor advanced from merely pickpocketing to survive, to more advanced petty theft, and then later to burglary. By the time he turned 18, Victor had also perfected every card trick in the book. He became a master of sleight of hand, which enabled him to cheat at games like poker or just hustle people on the street. The police, however, soon caught up with Victor's scams and robberies, and Victor ended up serving multiple stints in prisons in Budapest, Prague, Zurich, and Vienna. But a few months behind bars every now and then did little to dampen his spirits. He simply spent the time in jail improving his card skills or reading books. Because despite the fact that Victor left school at an early age, he was a keen learner, as he knew being well educated would help him with his scams and help him appear more sophisticated and professional, thus attracting less suspicion. However, like many Europeans of his time, Victor had heard stories about America, the land of promise, and all the opportunities waiting for a smart and resourceful guy like him. So he boarded a ship and headed to the States looking to get rich. But on the ship right there, two things happened. Firstly, he managed to get a 2.5-inch cut along his left cheek from an angry sailor who thought Victor was getting too friendly with his date. This attack left a permanent scar on Victor's face, which he would later tell people he got from a jewel of honor, when it was really just from flirting with someone else's girlfriend. But the second thing that happened on that ship to America was that Victor realized that transatlantic steamers like this were the perfect hunting grounds for hustlers like him. The first-class decks were filled with very rich marks that he could easily talk to and find a way to rip off. For Victor, it was like shooting fish in a barrel, so he'd spend a week aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic, fleece as many of the wealthy passengers as possible, then dock and rinse and repeat on a different ship with new passengers. And thus, the next few years were easy living for him, going back and forth on these ships between Europe and America. One of the most common cons he pulled on the ships was to pose as a successful music producer looking for investment in a Broadway production, which people only realized wasn't real after they'd already invested. However, the good times for Victor were brought to a halt by the First World War, as there were no more pleasure cruises between America and Europe. Now, as for what Victor actually did during the wartime years is a bit of a mystery, although he definitely wouldn't have taken part in any fighting. What is clear is that when the war ended, Victor showed up in New York City, and the man who stepped onto the pier was a far cry from the homeless boy who once had to scrounge through trash cans for food. Dressed in a fine custom-tailored suit with a silk shirt and camel hair topcoat, he now styled himself as Count Victor Lustig, and claimed to be a rich aristocrat in political exile. He had everything he needed. The way he looked, the way he talked, the way he carried himself, they all suggested old money and sophistication. So it was no surprise that almost everyone he met was taken in by Victor's wily charms. Victor had reinvented himself once again and created a persona that would be perfect to pull off some much bigger scams. In 1919, Victor met and married a woman named Roberta, who was so infatuated with her new husband that she stayed with him even after finding out he wasn't really a count and how he'd made his money by ripping people off. Unfortunately, Victor's personal life would end up being his downfall, but we'll get to that. The Roaring Twenties were a period of excess for Americans, and thus a perfect opportunity for Victor, who preyed on their greed. Besides classic grifts, he also had a short stint as a counterfeiter, manufacturing fake whiskey stickers and government stamps for bootleggers. However, Victor soon had a better idea, a money machine that could print duplicate dollar bills. Now, obviously it wasn't real, but Victor just had to find some people gullible enough to believe it was, and sell them this fake machine for large sums of money. So Victor had many of these boxes made by a skilled carpenter in New York, and they certainly looked impressive, about 2 feet in length with brass trim and a bunch of dials. Victor told people all you had to do was put a real $100 bill inside, plus a blank piece of currency paper, turn a crank, and then wait at least 6 hours, and the machine would print an exact replica of your $100 bill onto the currency paper, thus leaving you with 2 identical $100 bills. Victor called it the magic money machine. Now you're probably thinking, how can anyone be dumb enough to fall for that and actually buy this fake money machine from him? Well, here's how the con works. Firstly, Victor would go to the bank and get a bunch of brand new $100 bills, which meant the serial numbers would be in sequential order. This meant he just had to scrape off the last digit of the serial number and reapply the same last digit on several notes, thus creating a stack of seemingly identical $100 bills. Remember, Victor already had counterfeiting experience, and he only had to change the last digit of the serial number, so with some practice, he was able to perfect this. Secondly, Victor would never approach his targets about buying the box. Instead, he'd first find a way to gain their trust. For example, one of his victims was a wealthy gambler, and so Victor picked his pocket and stole his wallet. Then he went back to that same person he just pickpocketed and said, "Hey, you dropped this," and gave him the wallet back. This immediately made Victor seem like an honest, kind citizen just trying to help, so it lowered their guard. And Victor used this as an in to strike up a conversation and subtly engineer the conversation towards the magic money box. Victor would mention it could duplicate banknotes, but then he acted like he didn't want to talk about it, which of course only made people want to know more. Soon, the victim would be begging to see a demonstration of this money machine. And although Victor would pretend to be reluctant at first, he'd eventually agree. And they'd go to his hotel room where Victor would insert a $100 bill into the machine. But because Victor had come up with the lie about it taking 6 hours, that gave them time to chat, play cards, or eat dinner whilst the machine supposedly did its work. When they returned, the machine would have both the original $100 bill inside and a second $100 bill that looked identical, as if it had really been perfectly cloned by the machine. Of course, in reality, Victor had simply hidden the second note inside the machine beforehand, and they only looked identical because he'd used his counterfeiting skills to change the serial numbers to match. Now, the target would normally still have some doubts, so they'd go to the nearest bank, where the bank teller would confirm that it was indeed a genuine note, because it was a real $100 bill. Nothing had been printed on printing paper. This was just a banknote Victor had withdrawn earlier. But once the bank teller confirmed it was real, this was normally enough for the victim to believe the machine actually had printed the bill like Victor had claimed. But here's the clever part. Whilst they'd been chatting, Victor had dropped hints that he had an emergency situation where he needed a lot of money quickly, and that he was frustrated because his machine took 6 hours to clone each $100 bill and it was taking too long. So then his victim would come up with an idea. Well, what if I buy the money machine off you? Remember, Victor specifically targeted wealthy people he knew had a lot of cash, like businessmen or gamblers he'd seen win big. But of course, the victim thought they were getting an amazing deal, getting this money machine for a one-time fee that they could use over and over again. Using these tactics, Victor sold multiple copies of his money box throughout the country for tens of thousands of dollars each. And because of the lie he'd invented about the money machine taking so many hours to print each $100 bill, it meant he had plenty of time to flee the area before his victim realized he'd been scammed. By the time they figured out they'd they'd bought a worthless wooden box, Victor was long gone. But here's the real genius of the scam. Despite repeating this con over and over again, Victor was safe from the law because none of his victims ever went to the police or reported him. I mean, how could they? You can't exactly go to the police and complain that your counterfeit money printing machine didn't work as advertised. So most of them just had to accept they'd been ripped off. However, there was one wealthy woman Victor sold a money box to, who after realizing she'd been scammed, spent weeks hunting Victor down. Her name was Billy Mae Schiebel, and eventually she did manage to track him down to a hotel room in another city. But here's the plot twist. When she finally found him, there was no threats or violence. Instead, she was filled with admiration at his resourcefulness and said they should become partners in crime and work together. In fact, the two not only started doing some scams together, but also became lovers, and Victor left his wife to be with her. He would later regret that decision. But for now, things were going great for Victor, and he was already planning the biggest con of his career. One day in May 1925, Victor read a newspaper article about the decaying condition of the Eiffel Tower and how it would be cheaper for the French government to tear it down than it would be to fix it. You see, originally, the Eiffel Tower was intended to be temporary, as it was constructed for the 1889 World's Fair in Paris and was supposed to be demolished 20 years later. But by 1909, Parisians had grown accustomed to their new landmark, so it stayed on. However, by 1925, the Eiffel Tower was in disrepair and talks about demolishing it had been renewed. Hearing this news gave Victor an idea that would place him in the Hall of Fame of fraudsters. He was gonna sell the Eiffel Tower. He arrived in Paris later that same month, accompanied by a frequent sidekick of his named Dapper Dan Collins. Like all of Victor's cons, this one had been meticulously planned in advance, with every step carefully laid out. First, Victor used his extensive contacts in the criminal underworld to obtain some forged stationery and credentials from the French Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, which was responsible for the Eiffel Tower. Then, he headed to a luxury hotel in Paris, where he booked his room under the guise of a government official. From there, he delivered letters to 6 of the biggest scrap dealers in Paris, inviting them to the hotel to discuss a private matter he said was way too sensitive to talk about in public. Once the men had assembled in Victor's hotel room, he delivered a carefully rehearsed speech in fluent French about how the government intended to demolish the Eiffel Tower, but didn't want to publicize the decision yet out of fears over a public outcry. They, however, had been trusted with the information so they could bid for the salvage rights. The scrap dealers were like putty in Victor's hands, and he knew exactly how to play them. Firstly, he made them feel important by letting them in on the big secret. Then, he gained their professional interest with specifics on the tower. Victor knew all the details, all the correct measurements, and even how many rivets there were inside the Eiffel Tower. He had done his homework extensively. But finally, Victor ended with the number that all the men inside that room cared about: 7,000. That's how many tons of salvageable high-grade iron they would get from the tower. Victor's audience was mesmerized and already saw it as the deal of a lifetime. Unsurprisingly, they all presented him with sealed bids for the project. But truth be told, Victor had already found his target: André Poisson. As it was clear, André was quite desperate for that one major deal that would take his company to the next level. So Victor asked him to stay behind to discuss something in private. When it was just the two of them, Victor started talking about the hardships and limitations of a government job. To Andre, the intent was obvious. He was looking for a bribe. Weirdly enough, this actually put the scrap dealer at ease. Bribes were a routine part of doing business for him, and it also explained why Victor had arranged the meeting in a private hotel room. So ironically, the fact Victor had asked for a bribe is what made Andre believe the whole deal was definitely real. And thus, Andre had no problem writing a very generous check for the man he assumed to be just another corrupt, mid-level government official. But once the scrap dealer had left, Victor immediately cashed the check and caught the first train to Austria, pleased with a job executed perfectly. He spent the next few weeks in a luxury hotel in Vienna, waiting to read about his scam in the papers. But he never did. He soon realized that Andre kept the whole matter quiet out of shame and embarrassment for falling for the scam. After all, if you'd given someone a huge bribe to win the contract of buying the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal, would you really want to publicly admit you'd fallen for the scam? But the fact Andre hadn't publicized the scam or gone to the police gave Victor another bolt of inspiration. This meant he could do the exact same scam again. And that's precisely what happened. A few months later, Victor returned to Paris and repeated the whole con with different scrap metal dealers. Once again, he walked away with a nice fat check, but this time his mark did go to the police. So once the story was out, Victor thought it best not to tempt fate and instead returned to the United States. But the fact he was able to do this more than once just shows why scammers often get away with their schemes for so long. People don't want to admit they've been scammed. However, for Victor Lustig, eventually he would push things too far, and his downfall would soon begin. Although he was now a rich man, once Victor was back in America, he had no intention of slowing down. No target was too big or too small for him. There's a story that he even dared to swindle the notorious mobster Al Capone. Victor told Capone he needed $50,000 to finance a scam, and that he could double Capone's money in just 2 months. However, Victor then returned the money to Capone in full, saying the scam had gone wrong. Capone was impressed with his honesty and handed him $5,000. Of course, this was Victor's plan all along. He'd never intended to do anything except return the money to Capone in the hopes of a reward. However, when the Great Depression overwhelmed America, Victor found that the well of high-paying marks started to dry up. So he returned to counterfeiting again, except this time he was thinking much bigger. In 1930, he started a new racket with a man named William Watts, a pharmacist who also happened to be a high-class engraver. Their fake bills were of the highest quality, the super notes of the era as they were described by one authenticating expert. And to keep in line with Victor's grand ambitions and confidence, they made $100 bills. Other counterfeiters stuck to low denominations since those were easier to pass around unnoticed, whereas $100 bills received the most scrutiny. Victor knew this, but he didn't care. He was confident that his product was good enough to match the real thing. Ultimately, this brash overconfidence would prove to be his downfall. It all started in 1931 when Victor showed his audacity once more by conning a Texas sheriff with the money box scam. Once the sheriff realized he'd been duped, he tracked Victor down to Chicago and confronted him at gunpoint. But Victor was always a smooth talker even under pressure, and simply explained that the machine was probably defective. He apologized to the sheriff and offered him $50,000 compensation, double what he'd paid for the box. The sheriff walked away a happy man, but soon discovered that he had been conned again as he'd been giving counterfeit money. This was Victor's first big mistake, because it put him on the radar of the Secret Service. Back then, the Secret Service main job wasn't to protect the President of the United States, but to stop counterfeiters. When they heard about such a large payout being made using high-quality, fake $100 bills, they knew they were dealing with a big operation, but they weren't prepared for just how big it actually was. Over the course of the last few years, Victor and Watts had made over $1 million in hard-to-trace counterfeit money, which had already been distributed to the public. There was genuine concern that the operation could destroy confidence in the dollar and shake the foundations of the American economy. So in 1934, a special squad was assembled to catch Victor, which consisted of Secret Service and Treasury Department agents, New York police officers, and state troopers. However, it was ultimately an anonymous tip that led to Victor's capture in May 1935, as someone gave the authorities the address of Victor's counterfeiting headquarters. Then, on May 10th, the police intercepted a call that Victor himself would be arriving there at a certain time, and so the authorities made sure they were there to arrest him when he showed up. Victor was hauled off to jail. But who did the police get this information from? Well, it's widely believed that the anonymous tip came from Billie Mae, the woman who Victor had had an affair with. But apparently, after Victor dumped her for a new partner, she'd given the tip to the police out of anger and jealousy. Either way, Victor was looking at decades in prison for this. No amount of smooth talking could get him out of a charge for producing millions of dollars of counterfeit money. But then in September of that year, Victor added one final feat to his already remarkable criminal resume when he escaped from the supposedly escape-proof federal detention center in Manhattan. He'd fashioned a 50-foot rope from bed sheets and cut through his bars using a pair of pliers someone had smuggled in for him. As he shimmied down the side of the building using the bedsheet rope, he pretended to be a window washer, casually wiping at windows as he shimmied down so it didn't look like he was escaping. Confident as always, Victor even left behind a note on his pillow to taunt the guards about his escape. Unfortunately for Victor, by this point he had such a notorious reputation that a lot of resources were spent on finding him again, and thus he was caught less than a month after escaping from the detention center. This time, there would be no chance of escape, as Victor was sentenced to 20 years in prison on the dreaded Alcatraz Island, the ultimate maximum security prison. Although technically it wasn't Victor Lustig who was sentenced, as by this point he was using the alias of Robert Miller. Although some believe Robert may have been his actual real name that the authorities had managed to uncover. But what we know for sure is that Victor, or Robert, or whoever this conman really was, spent the rest of his life behind bars. He frequently complained to the Alcatraz guards about an illness he had, but they thought he was faking it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't. He died of pneumonia on March 11th, 1947, at the age of 57. His death certificate listed his occupation as apprentice salesman, an amusingly understated title for one of the most daring and successful conmen who ever lived.